Dear students, I hope you are all well and studying in your home. Today we will start the fourth chapter of biology, pollination and fertilization. In this chapter, the syllabus you have to cover self and cross fertilization and pollination. Okay, and scope of syllabus is explanation, advantages and disadvantages of self and cross pollination. Evidence of pollination and the characteristic feature of flowers pollinated by various agents such as insect, wind, and water. A brief idea as to how nature favors cross pollination and events taking place, pollination and fertilization leading to the formation of zygote in the embryo sac. A brief explanation of the term double fertilization and triple fusion. Fruit and seed definition and significance. There are some new terms for you in this chapter, so you have to read carefully. And if you have any doubt, you can ask me. So, first, we start with the introduction. The primary recruitment or requirement for sexual reproduction is the complete fusion of male and female gametes by the process called fertilization. But the male and female gamete producing structures, pollen grains, and ovules, respectively, are born on different parts of flower. The pollen grain must be transferred from anthers to the stigma of carpel to bring about fertilization. As you see in figure also. Okay, when we go through in detail, then we read about self fertilization and cross fertilization. And what is pollination? The transfer and deposition of pollen grains from an anther to the stigma of a carpel in a flower is called pollination. I hope you read the last chapter, structure of flower, very well. So you now aware about the different structures found within flower. So you can understand these terms. So self-fertilization and cross-fertilization. First, we have read about the self-fertilization or self-pollination. Autogamy is called when the pollen grains from the anthers of one flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower. Okay, or you can say within the same plant or flower born on the same plant. It is called self-pollination. That's why it's known as self-pollination or autogamy. Okay, you can see here self-pollination is occur because the anther of this plant is pollen grains from the anther of this plant goes to the stigma of the same plant. Okay, and self pollination mostly occurs in either bisexual flower or monoecious plants. If flowers are unisexual, to achieve self pollination, the flower must possess certain adaptations such as bisexuality, hermaphrodite. Okay, it means flower should be hermaphrodite. The flower should bear both the stamens and carpels so that both the pollen grains and ovules are born in the same flower. If plant bear or flower bear both stamen and carpel in the same plant, then the process of self pollination will be occur. And monoecious plant, if the flowers are unisexual, both the male and female flowers should be present on the same plant. And homogamy, to ensure self pollination, both the anthers and stigma of the bisexual flower or unisexual flower present on the same plant should mature simultaneously. Okay, means they both simultaneously will be matured. That's why the process of fertilization will be take place. And next is clistogamy. Okay, clistogamy is the pollen grain from the anthers get deposited over the stigma of the same bisexual flower which never opens. For example, some species of balsam, sundew, pansy, wood sorrel, oxalis, commonliana, etc. are the example of clistogamy. Okay, in this the stigma is never open. And in pollination, in some plants, say pea, wheat, and rice, the anthers and stigmas of bisexual flower ripen before the opening of buds. Self pollination occurs before the flower opens in this condition. You can see in figure the process of cross pollination. You can see this is a different plant, and from here anthers, from anthers pollen grains goes to the stigma of the another flower. This is the second flower. So there are some advantages of self pollination. First is chances of pollination to occur are greater if flowers show homogamy. Parental traits are preserved from generation to generation. Very large number of pollens need not to be produced. Small number of pollens will ensure pollination. The flower need not to be large and showy. Scent and nectar need not be produced by the flowers for attracting pollinating agents, because it's easy when when self pollination occurs within the same plant. So there are some disadvantages also. First is reported self pollination decreases the vigor and fertility of future generation, and the weaker or defective characters are inherited as such and weaken the species. Genetic improvement cannot take place because genetic diversity remains same. It will not you can say mutation or etc. New changes never found within this self pollination. Now we see about the cross pollination. When the pollen grains from the anthers of one flower are transferred on the stigmas of flowers born on different plants belonging to the same species, but their species should be same. It is called cross pollination or allogamy or genogamy. Cross pollination mostly occurs in dioecious plants having unisexual flowers, but a large number of examples are available where, in spite of bisexuality, plants prefer cross pollination over self pollination. Okay, instead of having the same anthers and stigma on the same plant, still they occur cross pollination. How nature favors cross pollination? Nature always favors cross pollination because it helps in the formation of new and better new combination of characters. For this purpose, following adaptations are found in the plants. First is unisexuality. The plants bear either male or female flowers, that is, plants are dioecious. Examples are palm, mulberry, papaya, etc. Dichogamy, if the flowers are bisexual, the male and female organs mature at different times. First is protandrous. Protandrous means when the anthers mature earlier than stigma. Student, these are the terms which you have to remember. Okay, what is protandrous? What is dichogamy? And before that, in their synonyms, cross pollination also known as allogamy or genogamy, as self pollination known as autogamy. So these terms are important. So protandrous means when the anthers mature earlier than the stigma. The flower is said to be protandrous. Okay, you can see an example protandrous of flower of clerodendron. Okay, stamen mature before stigma, stigma mature after the stamens. So the pollination will be not occur. So they have to prefer cross pollination. Examples are salvia, sweet pea, sunflower, and protogynous. Protogynous means when the stigma matured before the anthers. The example are magnolia, custard apple, etc. Self sterility. In this condition, the pollens from the anthers of a flower fail to germinate on the stigma of the flower born on the same plant. It happens because of genetic incompatibility. Examples are Nicotiana, potato, orchids, etc. Okay, so when there are anthers are not germinate in this plant or flower, they have to also need for the cross pollination. One more example, hercogamy. Hercos are fence or barrier. The flower possesses a certain structural barrier. It does not allow self pollination though. The flower is bisexual and both the anthers and stigma mature simultaneously, easy in pansy and iris. A, a hand covers the stigma. Okay, a special type of covering found of the stigma, so self pollination not occur there. And is heterostyle. In this condition, the flower has style and anthers at different heights. Either the style is very long or anthers are at more height, so that the discourages self pollination. Primrose, oxalis, linum are examples. Okay, you can see heterostyle in primula flowers. So you can see here its position is different. Stigma is in a longer side, it is a narrower side. Okay, so it is pinnate and it is thermite. So it is also always prevent the self pollination. So there are some agents of cross pollination also. In cross pollination, pollen grains from the anthers of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower. The pollen grains need some abiotic or biotic agents such as wind, water, insects, birds, or animals to transport and bring about the pollination, because it is quite difficult if we compare with the self pollination. The most common agents are the wind and insects. It is also done artificially by the plant breeders for producing useful and better varieties. In table 4.1 shows the agents of pollination and the technical terms used for that pollination. Okay, so there are always for cross pollination any agent will be needed. Okay, whether it will be by wind or insects. So there are some different type of also cross pollination occur by these agents and their names also given. So first is, if cross pollination occur by wind, it is known as anemophily. If occur by water, it is known as hydrophily. If it occur by animals, it is known as zoophily. Okay, and if it occurs by insects, it is known as entomophily. By birds, ornithophily. Bats, chiropterophily. Snail, malacophily. Man, artificial pollination. So these are mainly three agents of pollination, and on that third, animals also have five types. So we will read about in details in the next class. I also try to find an animation video for you so you can understand the processes whatever we will discuss till now. Thank you.
Flowers use their beautiful petals and fragrance to attract insects. Why do they do that? Because the insects help them in pollination. So in this video, we're going to see what pollination is, and what are the different types, and how exactly do the insects help. So let's start with what is pollination. Pollination is simply the act of transferring the pollen grains from the anther, these are the anther, the top part of the male organs, to the stigma. Stigma is the top part of the female organ. So let me just show that. Here is the pollen grain sitting on the anther, top part of the male. Here's the stigma, top part of the female. The act of transferring that pollen grains from the anther all the way to, let me just try, from the anther all the way to stigma, that's basically what we call pollination. That's what pollination is all about. Now, based on whether the pollen grains are transferred within the same plants or they're transferred between two different plants, we can classify them into two kinds. So the first one we'll call self-pollination. Self-pollination. And the second one would be something called cross-pollination. Let me just write that correctly. All right, cross-pollination. So let's start with the self-pollination. What exactly is this? So as the name suggests, if the pollen grains are transferred within the same plant itself, then we'll say it's self-pollination. So one way that can happen is if you have pollen grains transferred within the same flower. So from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. This is self-pollination. But even if you have pollen grains transferred from the anther to the stigma of a different flower belonging to the same plant, I'll call this number 2, this is also self-pollination. Why? Because still the pollen grains are being transferred within the same plant. The pollination is still happening, the plant is still pollinating itself. That's the whole idea behind self-pollination, okay? So these are examples of self-pollination. For the first one to happen, the flower needs to be bisexual, meaning it has to have both the male and the female reproductive parts. Only then it can do this. On the other hand, if the flowers are unisexual, then they can still self-pollinate this way. A male flower can transfer pollen grains to a female flower belonging to the same plant. On the other hand, what do you think is cross-pollination? Can you guess that now? What do you think is cross-pollination? Well, cross-pollination is transfer of pollen grains from one flower to a flower of a different plant or a different tree. So for example, if you have pollen grains from here going all the way to the stigma of a different flower altogether, meaning different flower belonging to a different tree altogether, then that is what we call cross-pollination across two different plants. Of course, same species, obviously, but two different plants altogether. So I'll call this as number 3. This is in pink, so this is cross-pollination. Now you might say, cool, but how exactly does the pollination happen? How do the flowers take the pollen grains and transfer it to the stigma? They don't have any moving parts now, do they? Well, that's a great question. So the pollination depends on certain agents. Let me just write that down. Depends on certain agents. Agents are basically things that help in pollination. One of the most common agent would be wind. So the pollen grains will just get sprayed into the air, and then the wind will be the one that carries it forward. And because both the pollen grains and the stigma is very sticky, when the pollen grain comes very close to that stigma, it'll just stick to it. And of course, in some cases, they are not sticky, but they are very hairy. Even then, the pollen grains will get entangled very nicely with the stigma and they get stuck to it. And pollination happens. So with wind, self-pollination can easily happen because they're very close to each other, right? The stamen, the pollen grains and the stigma are very close to each other. So with wind or water, just like how wind helps in transferring pollen grains for land plants, water will help in transferring the pollen grains in aquatic plants. But what about cross-pollination? Now you see, for cross-pollination to happen, the pollen grains need to get transferred from one plant or from one tree to another. Now if these trees are very far apart, then the chances of cross-pollination reduces, right? So how do we effectively increase the chances of cross-pollination? This is where the insects come into the picture. So another important agent for pollination, especially cross-pollination, would be insects. Insects like bees, butterflies, moths, and even birds. But how exactly do the insects pollinate? Let me take an example of a bee over here. Let's say this bee is flying and it's a little hungry and it spots a flower. The flower attracts the bees by using its beautiful petals, its odor, and also by using the nectar. Now, what exactly is nectar, you may be asking? Well, nectar is this sugary stuff that the flowers produce near its base of the flower, which has a lot of sugar, it has a lot of protein, so perfect for these hungry bees. So what these bees do, they get attracted to that particular flower, they sit on that particular flower, and they start drinking that nectar. And as they start drinking that nectar, the pollen grains start sticking to the bees. Let me show you a couple of photos of that. Here on the top, you can see a bee drinking nectar from the flower. And as a result, you can see it's resting its legs on one of the anthers. And so pollen grains can easily stick to the bee. In the second case, you can see a lot of pollen grains sticking to this bee. This bee has been super busy. So coming back to our story, a lot of pollen grains can easily get stuck to this bee. So pollen grains get stuck to that bee. Let me now get rid of this photo. And then when the bee decides to move away, it carries those pollen grains with it. Now the bee goes on its way, on its journey, long journey maybe to its home, and then it spots another similar flower with the similar fragrance and the similar odor. And then again, it gets attracted to it and starts drinking the nectar from that. And while doing that, some of the pollen grains get transferred to the stigma, and that's how cross-pollination can happen. But it's important that the bees need to get attracted to the same species of the flower. For example, if this is a papaya flower, it needs to transfer that pollen grains to another papaya flower and not maybe watermelon flower. And it's for that reason, usually certain bees are always attracted to certain kinds of flower that increases the chances of successful cross-pollination. Okay, bee, you're done your job, go home. These bees turn out to be a major contributor of pollination. Okay. Now, of course, the pollination has happened, but that's not the end of the story. It's actually the beginning of the story. Remember, the sperms inside the pollen grain still need to travel all the way into the eggs, which are found in the ovaries. And that is something we'll talk about in the future video. So what did we learn in this video? We learned about what pollination is, which is basically the transfer of pollen grains from the anther, the top part of the male, to the stigma, the top part of the female organ. And this can happen in two ways. Self-pollination is when the pollination happens within the plant. This can happen within the flower or within two different flowers of the same plant. And cross-pollination is when pollination happens within two different plants. So from one flower of one plant to a flower of a different plant altogether. And then we saw the agents are basically what causes pollination. The examples of that would be wind and water. And certain insects also help in pollination.